Hi, I'm Michelle from Connecticut. I also am known as the Flour Girl. I own a bakery and cafe in Hebron, Connecticut, right outside of Glastonbury. We started baking at the Flour Girl Bakery about 1.5 years ago, and we specialize in artisan sourdough breads, but I love making any kind of bread, and I can't wait to share some of my favorite recipes with you. Today, we're going to be making one of my all-time favorites and one of our most popular recipes at the bakery. It is a sweet dough. That's a basic sweet dough that we're going to make two different ways. We're going to make one as a cinnamon roll recipe. We're going to make the other as a sticky bun recipe that is filled with decadent pecans, bacon fat caramel, and bacon drippings on the top of it. I can't wait to show you what these recipes look like. So we're gonna start off today by making our cinnamon roll dough. We're gonna use the same dough for both the cinnamon rolls and the sticky buns. It's a great way to be able to do two different recipes with the same base start. The yeast dough can be a little nerve-wracking, but we're gonna walk you through it, and it's really not that bad. So we're gonna start off by scalding our milk today. So I'm gonna go ahead over to the stove, and we're gonna pour in about 2 cups of milk into the bottom of a saucepan. Scalding the milk is a process that I think is really easy to try to skip over. It is more important than people think it is. You're really tempted to just throw 2 cups of milk in the microwave and let that warm up to the temperature you're looking for to get things going. But when you go through the process of scalding your milk on the stovetop, it really changes the proteins in the milk and the way that it interacts with the yeast, and it's gonna give you a more moist and flavorful dough. So we're gonna put in our 2 cups of milk onto the stovetop here, and we're gonna turn it at about a medium-high heat. You want to not walk away from this. It doesn't take very long for milk to scald, and it doesn't take very long for milk to boil and burn. So you have to make sure that you get right into that sweet spot, which is about 180 degrees to 190 degrees. Once you hit 212, it's too hot and it's going to take too long for it to go. So you want to keep this milk in the saucepan, and what we're looking for is for these little teeny bubbles to start forming right around the outside of the pan. If you start to see the big bubbles come up from the middle of the pan, then you've gone too far, and you probably want to start over. If you go to the boiling point on milk, it's actually going to start to make the recipe not go as far as the rising of the yeast. So we want to get this up to just about the right temperature. It's already starting to steam. It doesn't take very long for this to happen, and the bubbles are starting to pop up right around the edges of the pan here. This is going to be the first food that we give our yeast when we start this process of making the dough. So it's really important that what we give it to wake it up is exactly the right thing that it needs to have a nice moist dough as it continues along. So if you look down into the bottom here, you can see these bubbles coming right up around the edges, which gives us the exact right temperature, and you can actually start to smell the milk a little bit too, and that's another way to know that it's done. So once we have that all set, we're gonna go ahead and pour that in to our mixing bowl. Once your milk is scalded, you're going to want to let it cool off for a couple minutes so that it gets down to a little bit less of a temperature than it was before, probably between 100 and 120 degrees. To that milk, we're going to go and add 1 tablespoon of yeast. Now that our milk has gotten nice and frothy and started to interact with the yeast, we're going to go ahead and give it some more food. The first thing that yeast is going to want to eat is going to be flour, then we're going to give it a little bit more sugar. We want to make sure that this has a nice warm up to the next batch of flour that we're going to give it later on. So the first way to do this is to give it what we're going to call a pre-ferment, which means that we let the flour and the yeast interact for a couple minutes, about 25 minutes, so that it can really start to grow on its own before we start adding more flour to the process. So we went ahead and added a cup of flour and another 2 tablespoons of sugar to this yeast and milk mixture and sugar that's already in there. And then we're going to let this sit and start to bubble for about 25 minutes in a fairly warm place. You don't want to keep this in the fridge. So put this in a warm place. I like to cover it up at this stage to make sure that it stays nice and warm from inside. So we're going to cover this up and we're going to let it sit for about 25 minutes. while we're waiting for the cinnamon rolls dough and the sticky bun dough to rise, we're gonna go ahead and get the fillings prepped for the inside of them. Now the filling for these two different things is so close, but also just a little bit different. Both of them are gonna start with 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar. We're gonna go ahead and add that to a small bowl. You can use regular brown sugar or dark brown sugar to do this. I love both. It's a little bit easier to find regular brown sugar than dark brown sugar. And then for the cinnamon roll filling, we're gonna add another 1/4 of a cup of granulated sugar and then 2 tablespoons of cinnamon powder. And we just want to go ahead and mix this all together so that it's ready when the dough comes out of the oven. We're going to use this to spread it onto the dough to give it, of course, that classic cinnamon roll flavor. So we're going to put our cinnamon roll one to the side. We'll know which one it is because we can see the granulated sugar in it. The sticky bun filling does not have granulated sugar in it because it has so much stickiness in the bacon fat caramel that we're going to make that we really don't need to have the sticky bun underneath it. For the sticky bun filling, we're gonna start with 3/4 a cup of just brown sugar. So we're not gonna add the granulated sugar to this one. And instead of 2 tablespoons of cinnamon, we're gonna add 1 tablespoon of cinnamon. We want that cinnamon flavor, but we don't want it to be overwhelming. And then I'm gonna add just a pinch of nutmeg, and then also just a pinch, if you can find it, of ground cardamom. It's not a big deal if you can't get it, but the cardamom brings this warm flavor to the sticky bun filling that I feel like is hard to place, and it just really makes the filling. So we're gonna mix that one all together, and these can just stay right out on the counter until we're ready to go with our dough. All right, so this mixture that we made earlier with the yeast and with the milk is all set and ready to go, and you can tell that it's ready to go because it's nice and foamy. It's actually unlike any other dough that I've ever worked with before. It bubbles up and makes this beautiful foamy fermented mixture, and it smells delicious. So this is still a little bit warm, but we can go ahead and add everything that we need to do to add to this. So we're gonna go ahead and start by adding 2 eggs right into the bowl with the mixture that we have in here. So we're gonna crack those right in. And then to that mixture, we're gonna add 2 tablespoons of melted butter. It's important that this butter is melted, but it isn't piping hot. You don't wanna cook your eggs. So we're gonna add in 4 teaspoons of salt, and that serves as the salt ingredient for the dough, for the whole dough. So we're gonna mix this together with a whisk, which is gonna pull some of the bubbles out of it. We wanna make sure that we break up the egg yolks before we get them into the mixer, because I only wanna use a dough hook with the mixer. I don't wanna add the paddle attachment to it right off the bat. So we're gonna mix this in. And once that's all set, it almost looks like a custard. We're gonna go ahead and pour that into the bowl of our mixing device, whichever one you use. Now, the question always comes up on whether or not you can mix by hand. And the answer is yes, you can, but you need to be very strong, and it takes a lot of effort. This dough is a very smooth dough. We're looking for a very specific consistency. Something that's gonna take us about 5 to 7 minutes in the mixer is probably gonna take you 10 to 15 minutes with a lot of elbow grease by hand. So we have the bottom of this in our mixer. I've attached the dough hook attachment to it, and I'm gonna start by adding about half of our flour. So we're gonna try to get about 4.5 cups of flour in here at this stage, and we already have a cup of flour in it from earlier. So we're gonna put in about 2 cups of it right now to get things going. So I'm gonna start by turning on my mixer slowly. You never wanna start it off high. I think we've all made that mistake before, where the flour goes back up into your face, or the sugar, even worse, and then slowly start to speed it up. As this dough starts to incorporate, you're gonna start to see all of the flour coming into the middle. And once it starts to get into the middle and you can see the wetness of the dough, now it's time to add more flour. I'm gonna slow down the speed a little bit to do this, and I'm gonna add about half of what I have left, maybe a little bit more than that, so that I have about a cup of flour left in my bowl. This flour is optional flour. I want to add it if I need it. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. It's all depending on the temperature, the humidity, the elevation that you're at. You want to make sure that you're looking at the dough and not the ingredient amounts. We're really looking to see how much flour we need to get the dough to the point we want it to be at. It needs to be sticky, but not tacky. And it needs to be soft, and it needs to be smooth, but we don't want it to be liquidy, and we certainly don't want it to be crumbly. It's gonna take a couple minutes at this speed, which is about a 6 on my KitchenAid to get the dough really where you need it to go. It's gonna start to form a ball in the middle. It's gonna start to suck up all of the flour that's around the outside, and then it's gonna start slapping against the edge of the container, and you're actually gonna hear that slapping noise, and that's what we're looking for. So once it gets to that spot, we know that it's ready to come out, but it is gonna take a couple minutes to get there. And if you notice that it's not starting to pull away from the edges within a minute or so, then that's the point where you wanna start sprinkling in some more flour. So I can see here that even though my dough is nice and smooth, it's still sticking to the edges in the bottom. So I'm gonna slow down my mixer speed just a little bit and add about another half a cup in there, and then speed it back up again. And this should be enough to start to pull it back from the edges and really form this tight ball with the dough. So we can tell that this is just about done at this point because the mixing dough in the mixer has cleared. It's nice and soft on the bottom, and the dough is slapping against the edges. So I'm gonna go ahead and bring down my speed to a stop. And we're gonna go ahead and clear off the mixer. We're gonna take out the dough hook first, and then we're gonna pull our dough right out of here. And I am gonna need this on the counter for just a minute. I like to make sure that I can feel my dough also with my hands for a little. Even though we wanna use the mixer for the heavy lifting of the dough, we're gonna just lightly flour our counter and knead this around a little bit to just make sure that it's exactly the consistency that we want. It should be nice and sticky, but not too tacky. It shouldn't stick to your fingers, and it shouldn't break apart. You can pull on the dough a little bit, and you can see that gluten development in there. Once it's made itself into a nice, soft ball, we're gonna put that here. I'm gonna grab my big rising bowl here and spray the inside of it. You can use olive oil in here if you want to. I prefer to just use a cooking spray. We're gonna pop that right in there and cover this with saran wrap again so that it has a nice spot to stay warm and rise. Now, if you can put this into an oven that was preheated and then turned off, that's now at about 100 degrees, or if you have a microwave that's over your stove that has a light underneath it, that will also give you about a proofing oven temperature, you can pop that in there and it will only take about an hour to rise. We're looking for this to double in size before we're ready to work with it again. If you don't have a spot that's 100 degrees and you're keeping it at room temperature, it's probably gonna take about 2 hours for you to get this up to the spot that you need it to. So you wanna just make sure that you're really looking for the double in size. This dough should be just about at the bowl level and also not overflowing. If we go overflowing, then we've overproofed our dough, and that's not what we want either. So we want to make sure that it gets exactly to this nice dome shape. Make sure that you're selecting a bowl that will allow the dough to double in size. If you walk away from this dough for 2 hours and come back and it's all over your counter, you're gonna have to start over again. So you want to make sure that you find a nice bowl that's nicely greased, put the cover on it, and then you're gonna sit it for about an hour to an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, to get it to exactly where it needs to be. And I'll show you what that looks like when we come back. While we're waiting for our dough to continue rising, we're gonna go ahead and start making the caramel for our sticky buns. So the caramel for this is really what makes this recipe so special. It is a bacon fat caramel with pecans, and we want to start the recipe off by toasting our pecans. Now you can buy pecans that are already toasted, but I love toasting them myself and just getting them around. So we're just gonna put those pecans, 2 cups of them, into a dry pan over medium-high heat. It does not take very long for pecans to toast or for any nut to toast, so you really wanna be careful. Do not walk away from this. You can burn them so quickly. If you do get them to the point where they're burned, throw them out and start over. You do not wanna use burned nuts even a little bit in your recipe. So we're gonna push these around for a little bit inside of our pan. It doesn't take that long, maybe 3 or 4 minutes to get these pecans toasted up to perfection. So we're gonna just leave them in here and keep pushing them around, spreading them out in a nice even layer on the pan while they toast up. So you can tell that these pecans are all done because they are starting to smell nutty. And that's exactly what we're looking for with the when you're toasting any kind of nut, really. Is you're just trying to toast it to the point where you can get a little bit of a crisp on the outside of it and you can smell the nuts. Once you can smell it, you know that you've got it exactly where you need it. So we're gonna pour these onto our cutting board. These pecans are already broken into pieces for me, but I'm still gonna go ahead and give them a rough chop. We wanna make sure that we have enough to go across all of our sticky buns, and then we're actually gonna reserve some also to put in the middle of the sticky buns once our bacon is done as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and chop these up while they're nice and crispy from the frying pan, and then we're gonna move straight into our bacon. It is very important to use raw bacon when you make this recipe because you need to be able to render the fat out of the bacon. I'm looking for a bacon slice here that is not too thin and not too thick. If you happen to be able to find a maple flavored bacon in the grocery store, that is prime for what we're looking for because we're looking for a maple flavor anyways. So I'm gonna go ahead and lay out 8 strips of bacon inside my frying pan. This doesn't have to be pretty, they don't have to be flat, they just need to all be cooked evenly. So we're gonna put them all in the pan and then start to stir them around. You don't wanna wad your bacon up, but you also don't need to make sure that it's laid out exactly perfect. We're not making a BLT here. We're gonna cut this bacon up into little teeny pieces to make sure that it goes onto the top of the sticky buns, and also so that we can sprinkle it into the middle with the filling to get that nice bacony flavor. These sticky buns are one of my favorite things to make, and I think they're so much fun because you have to make them the day before. And then when you turn them over the next morning after they've baked off, they just look incredible. And they have such a glistening glow, and they're definitely a bad boy bake. You don't want to make these all the time. You definitely don't want to eat them all the time. They have a lot of fat in them, but they are such a delicious treat and something that you can make ahead and really impress people with the next day. So we're gonna let our bacon fry up in this pan here for a good 7 or 8 minutes until everything is nice and crispy and all of the fat has rendered out of it. All right, so this bacon is just about done here. You can see that it's getting nice and crispy, and most importantly, we have a lot of fat left in the bottom of it. So we're gonna go ahead and take this bacon and we're gonna pop it on some paper towels to degrease while we work with the rest of what's in the pan. I'm also gonna make sure I lower the heat on this pretty quickly. I don't want this bacon fat to burn, so I'm gonna bring it down to a low heat. Now, we're gonna go ahead and add 1.5 cups of brown sugar to this. We're gonna add 3/4 cup of butter, 1/3 cup of maple syrup, and then just a pinch of salt. The salt is something that I feel like people always forget. It's a really important part of the process. You really need salt in these sweet dishes in order to make sure that the flavors compromise each other well. We're gonna take this and very slowly and carefully, because remember this is sticky, hot, and it's got bacon fat in it, so you don't wanna get this on yourself at all. It's gonna burn you so badly if you do. So very slowly we're gonna go ahead and melt this in, and you're gonna see it's gonna immediately turn into this caramel color. And really what we're trying to do is bring this up to a very slow bubbling boil, and we're gonna let it sit there for about a minute. If you let it sit too long, you're gonna end up with toffee, which is also delicious, but not what we're looking for. We're looking for a very sticky stage of the caramel, and if you let it go too long, it gets to a hard crack stage, that's not what we're looking for in this specific case. The caramel that we're making here is gonna be a soft caramel that drips down into the cinnamon roll dough that we're putting underneath it. And we wanna make sure that we have that soft texture so that it can drip in between the crevices of the rolls. If we don't do it that way, then it's just gonna sit at the top and it's gonna look like a hard layer of candy. So we wanna make sure that we get this part of the process exactly right. It's not that complicated. You really just need to pay attention to it. And we're just really slowly stirring it around. I'm bringing this up to about halfway, so just about medium on my burner. If you're doing this on an open flame, make sure you're being very, very careful as well, because you want to remember that you're working with grease here, which is of course what bacon fat is, though we don't want to call it that because it seems less appetizing. It is a delicious topping to this, and having that bacon flavor throughout the caramel is really unique. This is not the same kind of caramel that you could wrap up in a package and eat it on its own like you would have as a candy, because it's still gonna be really drippy. So we're basically just getting it to the point where the sugar has all melted into the butter, and then once it's gotten to that spot and you can really see it, then it's gonna be good to go into our pans. So we're just gonna leave this for about 2 minutes, and then we'll get it into the pans and get the toppings in. So our bacon fat caramel is just about where we need it to be. It's turned a light golden brown and it's bubbling up throughout the whole process. You can smell the bacon coming from this caramel mixed with the sweetness. It is just such an awesome combination. I love making this recipe. So we're gonna go ahead and take that off of the heat. I'm gonna spray liberally the inside of my pans. Now you're gonna look for an 8 to a 9-inch round pan to do this with. You have got to spray every single nook and cranny of these pans before you put the caramel in there. The turn of the sticky buns and making sure that it flips over perfectly is all about making sure that it's gonna slide out of this pan. And because we're not baking these until the next day, we wanna make sure that we really do a good job of that. So we're gonna go ahead and split our caramel up into 2 different pans. I'm just eyeballing this. There's no reason to use another measuring equipment to do this. We're gonna pour that caramel right into the bottom. It should cover the whole bottom of the pan. And this is going to go ahead and start cooling even before we put our sticky buns inside of it, so that is fine. So while that's starting to cool off, the bacon is cool enough to touch at this point. So I'm gonna take the bacon and give this a chop. We're gonna wanna put about half of the bacon and the pecans inside these pans so that when you flip the sticky buns over at the end of the process, when they're done baking in the oven, you can see the pecans and the bacon sitting on top of the sticky buns. That's part of what makes it such an impressive dish. It looks like you had to do all kinds of crazy things to make it look like that, and really all you're doing is building your pan from the bottom up. We're gonna chop this up, and then we're gonna take the bacon and sprinkle it right into the caramel. It doesn't have to be perfectly even, you just wanna make sure that you've got enough going around. And then we're gonna do the same thing with the pecans. So you wanna get that in there, it's gonna sink right into that caramel. It's gonna become part of the caramel. It's so delicious. I'm gonna take the remaining bacon and pecans and I'm gonna give them another rough chop. These pieces I want to be a lot smaller. We're gonna use them in the filling of the sticky buns so that when you bite into a sticky bun, you get that bacon fat caramel on the top, you get the maple from the maple syrup, you get the bacon itself from the little pieces that are on the top, and then you have these little gems of crunch and salt in the middle, and it just makes such a delicious way to eat breakfast, though I realize that it probably doesn't qualify as breakfast once we've done everything we're gonna do to it. So we're gonna chop these all up, and then we're gonna leave it here to wait for our sticky bun dough to be ready. All right, so our dough has gotten to a nice puffy rise here. So we're gonna go ahead and pull it out of our bowl. Look at how soft and pillowy this is. It's not sticking to my hands at all, which is exactly what we're looking for. So we're gonna wanna go ahead and cut this in half, because remember, we made 2 of these so that we could make sticky buns and cinnamon rolls. So we're gonna cut it in half, and we're just gonna push one off to the side, and I'm gonna work with half of the dough first. I'm gonna start with the cinnamon rolls. Not that I have a preference, but I'm just folding this dough around and I'm gonna pat it out so that it starts to look like a rectangle. We're gonna try to get this into about a 9 by 12 rectangle if we're able to. Now, I don't find that I need to ever use flour on the bottom of the surface of this dough. It doesn't stick. It comes right off as a nice flat surface for it. And even though you have to pull it back up to get it rolling out, it really doesn't need the flour on it, and it does take away from the texture of the dough a little bit if you have to flour the surface first. Keep in mind that as you're doing this, the gluten is releasing in the dough and making it easier. So every time you start to roll out your dough, it's gonna shrink back a little bit, and then it's gonna spring out with less resistance than it did before. So you're gonna just push this along. Now, if you have a heavy rolling pin, you can use one of those as well. I tend to use my elbow grease for this, but it really could go either way. You do need a rolling pin though. You cannot do this with your fingers. It needs to be rolled out nice and flat and even, so that when you spread your toppings on them and when we do roll them up and get them into the oven, they have a nice even bake behind them. And I like to also try to keep it in a rectangle shape. So you can see that as I roll it, I'm continuing to pull my corners to bring it back to that shape of a rectangle, so that when it's done, it will be able to roll up easily, and we're gonna be able to cut even slices. Ideally, we're looking for about a 1-inch thick cinnamon roll, which is why we're rolling it out to about a 12-inch length, so that when it's rolled up, it's done. All right, so there is our dough all rolled out and ready for our cinnamon rolls, and I'm gonna go ahead and start putting some softened butter on this. I don't measure this butter out, I'm just putting on as much butter as I need to cover the entire dough. It doesn't need to be a thick layer, you're just looking for enough coating so that the whole dough is covered in butter. This is gonna help the cinnamon rolls stick together, it's gonna help give you that gooey center. It is really important that your butter is at a soft room temperature when you do this. If you try to do this with hard butter, you're gonna tear your dough. Once the dough has been torn, there's really no coming back from it at that point. You can try to push it together with your fingers, but you really need your dough whole, or you're gonna start oozing out your toppings from the middle. So we're gonna grab our cinnamon roll filling that we mixed up earlier, which was, remember, the brown sugar, the granulated sugar, and the cinnamon, and this was the one that had the 2 tablespoons of cinnamon in it. And I'm just gonna start grabbing that by the handful. You're not gonna end up using all of the filling, I always overmix it. And you're gonna just spread that around right on top of the butter. Make sure that you get all the way out to the corners of this. You really don't want to start having empty corners, because you will end up with cinnamon rolls that don't have filling in them, and nobody wants that. So we're gonna just make sure that this is all patted down, that we don't have any giant chunks of anything in it. You've got a nice even coverage on here, and then you're just gonna start rolling. I roll from the top, you can roll from the bottom. I think that's really a matter of personal preference. You just wanna make sure that as you go, you're tucking back underneath to get a nice tight roll. If you have a loose roll on this, then when your cinnamon rolls bake in the oven, they're gonna start to separate, and you'll have space between the layers, which makes for a much less moist dough, and the bake is just not the same. So we're gonna continue rolling this up. When you get to the end, we're gonna take the last piece, and see how I'm starting to push this together with my fingers just to seal that seam up. We don't want this to come undone when we start cutting it. It's very important to make sure that it all stays together. And then I'm just rolling it a little bit on the seam to make sure that it seals. And if I put this on my nifty little chart that I have here, I can actually see the inch marks, and I know that I have at least 12 inches of dough here, which is what I'm looking for, so that I have a minimum of a 1-inch thick cinnamon roll. To make sure that I keep myself accountable, because I'm not very good at eyeballing distance in the dough, I'm gonna first cut my dough in half. And you can see I'm using a sharp serrated knife to do this with. I feel that it's a much easier way to cut the cinnamon rolls. You can also use unflavored dental floss, and this is considered to be a hack for cinnamon roll making. I still prefer a sharp serrated knife. So I'm gonna cut it in half, and then I'm gonna cut it into quarters. And then each of those quarters is then gonna be cut into thirds. I feel if you do it this way, instead of starting at one end and then going to the other, that it really helps make sure that you have the right size for your cinnamon rolls. And remember, these are gonna rise overnight and then again tomorrow morning. So the fact that they're small right now does not mean that they're gonna be small tomorrow when they come out of the oven. So we're gonna finish cutting these up. And you wanna make sure too that you're using the serrated knife and sawing back and forth with this motion. If you push down with a sharp knife and you put the cinnamon rolls right to the countertop, then it's gonna squeeze the cinnamon roll and pinch it, and that's not what we're looking for. So we're gonna spray down a 9.5 by 11 dish. You wanna make sure that it's deep enough for the cinnamon rolls to rise up, and then we're gonna arrange them in a 3 by 4 pattern. So just carefully lift your cinnamon rolls. Some of the filling is probably gonna fall out when you move them over, and that's fine. It's really not a big deal. The reason that we're using softened butter instead of melted butter is because it's going to actually bake into the cinnamon rolls itself, so it makes the gooey center of the cinnamon roll while it's baking as opposed to when it goes onto the dough. That's really important for the way we're doing this, because when you put it in the refrigerator overnight, it's gonna get more gooey. So if you use a melted butter instead of a softened butter, it's gonna be too gooey too fast, and your filling's gonna fill up the bottom of the pan instead of staying inside the rolls. So those cinnamon rolls are all set. Make sure you tuck those end pieces underneath and not having the end up on top. They will taste just as good as the middles, or almost as good. And then we're gonna go ahead and wrap these up with foil or plastic wrap. And they're gonna stay in the fridge for a minimum of 12 hours. And the reason for that is because we're trying to ferment that dough. It's what gives you the special chew of this dough when it's done. Great. So I've gone ahead and rolled out the second half of the dough into the same 9.5 by 11 square, 9.5 by 12. And we're going to go ahead and spread our softened butter over this dough, just exactly as we did with the cinnamon rolls. There's no difference in this part of the process. So it's the same dough, it's the same size, and it's the same filling for now. So we're gonna roll that, or push that around so that we've got that nice even layer of butter on there. And it doesn't matter whether you're using salted or unsalted butter on this. I usually just use salted butter, to be honest, even though I know that's not the trend for baking, but it doesn't bother me to be able to just adjust the salt on my own. This is the brown sugar and cinnamon mixture. Now remember, this has a little bit of that cardamom in it, and it has a little bit of nutmeg in it as well. So it's gonna have a little bit of a warmer spice profile. Not much difference, but it's a little there. It also doesn't have any of the granulated sugar, and the reason that we did that, again, is because we already have the caramel going on the top of this, so we don't need so much sugar in this one. And then we need to remember to put in all of our delicious pieces of pecans and bacon. I'm gonna slide those pretty evenly over it. You don't want them layered so thick that it's difficult to roll up, and you definitely don't want any chunks that are too difficult to get through the rolls. So once this is all set, we're gonna roll this one up the exact same way. You'll find it's a little bit more challenging because you have the bigger chunks in here. We've got those bacon bits and the pecans in there, but we're just gonna roll up the dough. The dough is more forgiving than it looks like. We can get to the end and go ahead and pinch those seams shut and roll it again. Now this is when you really need to have a serrated knife, because we're looking to cut this, and you have to sometimes cut through the bacon and the pecan pieces that are in there. So we're gonna do the same strategy. I'm gonna cut this into quarters, and then I'm gonna cut those quarters into thirds, and that's gonna give us our 12 cinnamon rolls. These cinnamon rolls are going into two separate pans, or the sticky buns, I should say, are going into two separate pans, and that allows for ample space and caramel coverage. I always put the middles of the pans as the ends of the dough because they have the least amount of stuff in them. So the most concentration of pecans and bacon is going to be in the middle, and the least concentration of filling is going to be on the ends, so we do it accordingly. And then you're going to want to go ahead and put the other 5 evenly spaced around the exterior. And again, they will rise out to meet the edge of the pan by tomorrow, don't worry. So we're gonna put this in, close these up. These are going in the fridge. And then tomorrow morning, when you're ready to make your cinnamon rolls and your sticky buns, you wanna pull them out of the oven about an hour to an hour and a half before you wanna bake them until they're nice and puffy and risen up. And they can go in the oven and you're done. These cinnamon rolls and sticky buns I prepared yesterday so that we didn't have to wait overnight. The ones that you're gonna make are gonna sit in the refrigerator overnight so that they can ferment properly. We wanna make sure that that dough has plenty of fermentation time. It's what gives it the chew that we're looking for. So we've taken these out of the refrigerator and I've let them rise for about an hour to an hour and a half in a warm kitchen. And now they're all set and ready to go into the oven. The last thing that I want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and brush the tops of these with melted butter. There's no specific quantity needed here. I'm just looking to make sure that they don't get dried out in the oven. The dough has been out for a long time now, so we want to make sure that it stays nice and moist and we don't risk having it get dry. The sticky buns are a little bit less of a concern because they're going to be inverted anyways, but for the cinnamon rolls especially, we want to make sure that they get a nice coating of butter on the top of them before they go in the oven. That's going to bake down and into the rolls and make sure that they stay nice. Now we're going to add these into a 325-degree oven. You want to cook your cinnamon rolls and your sticky buns low and slow for two different reasons. The cinnamon rolls because we want them to get nice and puffy. The sticky buns because we want to make sure that we have time for the caramel to get nice and caramely again. So we're going to pop these into the oven and they're going to sit in here for about 20 minutes. Now while we're waiting for the sticky buns and the cinnamon rolls to finish, we're gonna go ahead and start on our cream cheese frosting. The first step in the cream cheese frosting that I do, and I do always feel like this is what sets us apart at the bakery, is that we make all of our powdered sugar from scratch, which is a lot easier than you think, and you probably have the tools to do it in your kitchen. You need granulated sugar and you need a powerful mixer. You cannot do this in a slow mixer or in a food processor. You really need something that has a lot of power behind it to do this. If you don't have that piece of equipment, you can certainly use powdered sugar that comes from the bag or the box. I just like the flavor of a fresh powdered sugar, and if you haven't had powdered sugar that's made fresh before, I would definitely suggest that you give it a try at some point. It gives it a totally different flavor. So we're gonna go ahead and add 1.5 cups of granulated sugar into the bowl of our blender. Put the lid on nice and tight. I'm gonna turn it on and start it on slow. You're gonna see the sugar start spinning around, and I'm gonna slowly turn it up to the maximum that your blender goes. Doesn't take very long, but we're gonna stop it real quick and just give it a quick shake. You'll see that it's actually starting to get nice and powdery already. The only thing you want to be careful of is that if you put it on blend for too long, it's actually going to start to melt the sugar because the heat of the blender will get in there with the sugar. So we're going to do this one more time. And you can tell that this is done by opening it up and taking some between your fingers. You want to rub it between your fingers, and you shouldn't be able to feel any of the granules of sugar anymore. It should feel just like powdered sugar that you would get out of the box. So we're going to take this and set it to the side and get ready to make our frosting. So we're going to go ahead and make our cream cheese frosting now that we have our sugar all set and ready to go. So we're going to start with room temperature cream cheese. I'm looking for about 4 tablespoons of cream cheese here, and then about 7 tablespoons of butter. And we're gonna put those right into the base of our mixer. I'm gonna go ahead and add some vanilla to that, just a teeny bit to start with to give it some liquid. And then we're gonna go ahead and start the mix. You wanna make sure that this butter and cream cheese has plenty of time to incorporate together before we start adding the sugar to it. So we're gonna beat it or cream it until it gets nice and incorporated. And you probably will have to stop it a couple times during the process to scrape down the edges of the bowl because you don't want to have it clump up and not get mixed when we're trying to do this here. So I'm just gonna scrape that down, start it again. And we're starting to get a nice cohesive look with inside of the butter and the cream cheese. So I'm gonna get ready to add my powdered sugar. You want to be really careful not to do this all at once, and you want to be really careful not to do this while the mixer is going, and especially while it's going too fast, or you will get a face full of powdered sugar. Powdered sugar that's homemade is even more fluffy than powdered sugar that comes out of the bag, and it will come right back up at you if you're not careful with it. So we're going to add this in, and again, it's about 1.5 cups of powdered sugar. Very slowly, we're going to start to increase the mixer speed until it starts to incorporate. I'm gonna add a little bit of milk. You definitely don't need more than 2 tablespoons of milk to get this to pull together, but you're gonna wanna eyeball it depending on how well and quickly it's coming together. So as the mixer goes, you can see it pulling the powdered sugar into the butter mixture. And we're gonna add a little bit more vanilla too in a second. So that looks good. I'm gonna add a little more vanilla. You never measure vanilla. You measure vanilla with your heart. And we're gonna put a bit of salt in there as well, because again, you wanna make sure that you have that salty flavor to bring out the sweetness. And we're just gonna turn this up to the max speed and let this whip together until it turns into a nice creamy frosting for our cinnamon rolls, which will be out of the oven in just a minute. All right, so I can tell that these sticky buns and the cinnamon rolls are ready because I can smell them. And they have a nice golden color on the top, so we're gonna go ahead and pull them right out of the oven now. And take a look at that. You can see how perfectly golden they are, and you can see the spirals in the cinnamon rolls. Now I'm gonna pull the sticky buns out. Be very careful with these sticky buns because the caramel has melted again at the top, and it is gonna drip down around the sides. But we need to let this cool off for a little bit before we flip them over. The cinnamon rolls we can start working with right away. So the sticky buns, the caramel is gonna start to re-caramelize because it's essentially liquid now at this point. So we're gonna wanna go ahead and work with our cinnamon rolls first. I like to frost my cinnamon rolls when they're pretty hot because I wanna make sure that the frosting has an opportunity to drip down between all of the individual coils of cinnamon roll. So I have this frosting that we made earlier, and nothing fancy here. I'm not measuring anything out. I'm just gonna spread this evenly and generously over the cinnamon rolls. We do not want to not have enough frosting because that is a quintessential part to the cinnamon roll. Make sure that you're careful not to burn your hands when you're brushing these across here. We don't want to pull them out of the pan yet, but you can see this melting down in there. You can smell the vanilla from the frosting coming up, and you can really see how the cream cheese stands up to the top of it while the butter melts down, and that's why it's just such a perfect combination for cinnamon roll toppings. I can't imagine putting anything else on them. I do make a Christmas roll sometimes that has fruit in the filling with the same exact dough. It has cranberries, apricots, and golden raisins that we mix into the dough. And then the frosting that we put on the top is the same, except we add a little bit of lemon zest to it. And that is a really fantastic way to also use this dough if you wanted to do something that had the dried fruit in it. You really don't have to change anything about the process that we went through. You just would be adding those extra ingredients to it. And it gives it a nice, delicious flavor, and you can use the same frosting for that. So those are all set. We're gonna let them chill out for just a minute while we address our sticky buns. Now this looks a little more complicated than it is. I promise you it's not. You want to have a pan ready, and we're essentially just going to invert our sticky buns. Now, you can do it where you put your pan on top of it and then flip the whole thing upside down, but I've been doing this for a while, so I'm just gonna flip it in one motion. Flip that right over and give it a second to drip down, because I promise you there is a lot of goodness up there. And when you pull this up, you're gonna see a pretty impressive display of caramel and sticky bun and bacon and pecans, and it just makes a really beautiful breakfast. The sticky bun, or the cinnamon rolls, have to obviously come out. You can see how those are nice and fluffy. We've got that frosting dripping all the way down there. I'm gonna twist those out. They're nice and warm, and the great thing about this is we made it the night before, so you can have this pretty much done if you were doing like a Christmas morning or something. Have it done, and then all you have to do in the morning is let them do their final rise and then bake them in the oven. So there we have it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you are going to be able to test these recipes at home, the cinnamon rolls and those sticky buns at your next breakfast with your family. If you want to try either of these products in person, you can certainly visit us up at the Flower Girl Bakery, which is going to be open very soon in Hebron, and you can always stop in the cafe as well while you're there. Join me next time on our next episode, where we'll be baking at the bakery itself and being able to see that brand new space when it's open, and we'll be able to share some more recipes, hopefully show you some sourdoughs, maybe some cupcakes, and our famous cookies.